In this lecture, we'll be discussing about the various factors that are to be considered while fixing the number of slots in a squirrel cage rotor. So there are certain rules that we have to follow while selecting the number of rotor slots in a squirrel cage induction motor. So let us see which are those rules. So first one, the number of rotor slots should never be equal to the number of stator slots, but must either be larger or smaller. So first rule demands that the number of rotor slots and number of stator slots should never be equal. So number of rotor slots can either be larger than the stator slots or it can be smaller than the stator slots. Second point is that the difference between stator slots and rotor slots should not be equal to P, 2P or 5P in order to avoid synchronous cusp. So here P denotes the number of poles. The difference between stator slots and rotor slots should not be equal to P, the number of poles, or 2 times the number of poles or 5 times the number of poles. And this is done in order to avoid the synchronous cusp. And the third point, the difference between stator slots and rotor slots should not be equal to 3P for 3-phase machines in order to avoid magnetic interlocking. So in case of 3-phase machines, to avoid the risk of magnetic interlocking, it is needed to be ensured that the difference between stator slots and rotor slot is not equal to 3 times the number of poles. And next one, the difference between stator slots and rotor slots should not be equal to plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus P plus or minus 1 and plus or minus P plus or minus 2 in order to avoid noise and vibrations. So these are the four rules that we have to follow while fixing the number of rotor slots. And summarizing all these 4 points, we can say that in a squirrel cage induction machine, SS minus SR, that is the difference between stator slots and rotor slots, should not be equal to 0. So this is obtained from the first rule. The first rule says that the number of stator slots and number of rotor slots should never be equal. That means their difference should not be 0. Okay. So SS minus SR should not be equal to 0. Plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus P, plus or minus 2P, plus or minus 3P, plus or minus 5P, plus or minus P plus or minus 1 and plus or minus P plus or minus 2. Okay.